Thank you so much. And can I say, Caterina and I are just honoured to be on the same platform as distinguished Madalena here. In fact, it's just an action of history. I don't think it's a great honour to be on the same stage. Thank you. And that's why the crowd's here. So I hope I keep the crowd here until lunchtime. There's nothing worse than being speaking before lunchtime, is there? That's one of the challenges in life. But I want to also say that a lot of what I was about to say has already been said in the earlier conversation. With hands up, who was at the wonderful session with Bruno Meschitelli and the other group? Just the other group? Yeah, most of you were.
Yes.
Yeah. So a lot of what I'll be saying is actually that Caterina and I will be saying will confirm or elaborate some of the things that were said in the other session. So what I'll try to do, I suppose, is to say some things about our research, and then try and link it back to something that Madalena said, and also talk a bit about what I see as one of the ways forward, to try and think about how we can bring together migration studies, social history, public history, post-colonial studies, and so on. And let's look at the work of some of the French post-structural theorists, particularly Deleuze and Guattari. So some of their ideas will come into our conversation towards the end. So we're dealing with this group we call the latest wave of Italians. And they, of course, they are large in number, but they are migratory, they are circulatory, much of migration of Italians was in America and elsewhere. So the Golandrini, who came from Genova, went down to work in the Argentine wheatlands in the 1830s, were just like this. They got on ships, they came down through the Atlantic, they got off the ships in Buenos Aires, they worked, exploited in the wheatlands of the Pampas, got back on the boats, went back to North Italy, and they contributed to their family fortunes in places like Treviso. Now, and in Liguria and certain parts of the north of Italy. And so the issue really is that only 20,000 have stayed behind. And that's what Meschitelli and his co-authors say. And that's very important to remember. They leave behind, but they trigger a whole series of interactions between themselves and the rest of us living in Australia and Indigenous Australians. And so there's a kind of a sense in which they are perhaps more significant than their mere numbers might suggest.
Robert, stick to the right of the computer so people can see your PowerPoint.
Excellent, thank you. I've only been teaching for 40 years, so I still make mistakes. Thank you so much for that. I do like students who interact in my lectures, so please feel free to say more things or whatever you want to do. My writing is actually, it's in 28-point aerial, so it follows the conventions of PowerPoint, and I do my best. But I'm always ready for it to be improved. So we ask several questions. The first of all is obvious one: who are they? How has their use of the World Wide Web influenced the way they came here and what they're doing here in Australia? What are their politics? Are they going to become anarchists like the Sacco Vanzetti generation in Boston in the 1920s, who felt totally marginal to the Brahmins of Boston and embarked in that wonderful explosion, effervescence of anarchism that we saw culminating in the execution of Sacco Vanzetti, which set waves around the world in terms of its politics? Are they unitaries, a cohort? And obviously they're not. We're going to argue they're actually driven by a fundamental difference between what we're going to call the smooth workers, to use Deleuze Guattarian theory, and the striated workers, the workers who are working as mobile workers, or those who are working in fixed location. What are their strategies for establishing an identity as a new community? To what extent do they belong or not belong here in Australia, and what will be their influence over time? So we're using oral history. We've got a sample so far of 30 of these people. We found them through snowball sampling, particularly here in Melbourne, but found a few now in Sydney, a few other parts of Australia. So we're gathering as we go. And we're trying to find them in all kinds of locations. So here at Coesit, for example, some of them are here teaching. Some of them we find in the street. The other day I found a new one who was a young man from Brindisi who was completely deranged. This process of being between the two countries just was messing with his head. And I hope to catch up with him again in Chapel Street in Windsor, those who know Melbourne. And he is, if you like, kind of on the margins. So he's classic in terms of trying to understand some of the casualties of this process. But we're also using the social media representations, so that's what we talk about today because it is public and we don't have to go through many ethical hoops to talk about it. So yes, they're very different from the previous group. They're from the north, they're better educated, and they come here with peers and friends, not with kin. That's really important. So, and a lot of them come from parts of Italy that haven't known out-migration before. However, of course, there's always the Veneto. And those of you who are Trevigiani, and a few in the room, you belong to a very special group of Italians who've been everywhere and go everywhere, and you understand migration a lot better than a lot of other Italians, because this process is really part of what makes up your cultura contadina. You are part of this mobile global culture. And when we go to Facebook, we find them talking about themselves. So Luigina Matera and Roberto Ginasala, who works in the IT industry in Windsor, here in Melbourne, are kind of a classic couple. And they talk about their life here in Australia quite openly, and so it's ethical for me to repeat some things that they've said in public. And they announce themselves as lovers on Facebook, and they move from Italy to Melbourne, and they have some experiences here that are worth knowing about. So in literature that already exists, we know from the work that Bruno and his colleagues have done a lot about these people already, which confirms that our sampling is actually quite sound. We've actually got a sample that picks up most of what Bruno and his colleagues are talking about in terms of this population. I need to stress that a lot of them are sponsored, not sponsored, and also do not have an involved family reunion. So in a sense, they are already different from other groups of people coming to Australia. And very few of them acquire citizenship in Australia. We discussed that just a minute ago, so I won't go into that detail. But nonetheless, they are a presence, and they're an important presence in this country. And we want to contend, in fact, that they are the fourth wave. In my book, Buongiorno Australia, which came out in 1987, I talked about 3 waves of migration from Italy. I talked about the esploratori, the scouts, who were, to go back to the conversation of earlier today with Joe Lobianco, they're the people who were associated with the ideas of Grand Tour. They're the people who travelled the world and brought to Australia in particular a whole lot of important aspects of Italian high culture. So, for example, Carlo Catani redesigned the river here in Melbourne. It had been a sort of a typical kind of gangly river that ran through the city. He straightened it. In classic striating sense, he made it a straight river. That's why it's a muddy river, it was a dirty river, but he gave it form. And he brought here to Melbourne, as a Florentine, an idea of the Arno, which was reimposed here. Or if you visited our exhibition building, you'll see it's a copy of the Duomo in Florence. So there are these very obvious connections that these scouts brought with them, and often they went back. So in the image, of course, is Raffaele Carboni, who was at Eureka, our rebellion in 1854. He wrote an opera called Gilbernia, which was alluded to by John yesterday, or Thursday, which is about Indigenous Australians. So these people encountered the frontier, they knew the frontier, and their observations of life in the colonies is really important. And then there's a group we call the Pescatori, who are farmers and fishermen. This is a group of people from Sorrento, south of Melbourne, who are farmers, but of course dress up, and they bring family, they bring community activities. They bring the first festa in Australia. They bring the first celebrations of their identity. And then, of course, the post-war migrants in particular, from the 1940s on, which this is a group of workers in a cafe here in Melbourne, in West Melbourne, called Don Camillo's. And this photograph is taken by a very famous photographer, Benjamali. So these are workers who we call the builders of the Little Italy. They're people who make, in Robert Harney's terms, the ambiente that is Little Italy, that is Carlton and equivalent suburbs around Australia. And so these people are coming from quite different Italies, and they're bringing quite different ideas to Australia, and they're quite differentially influencing the formation of the modern state, the modern nation. So they, using Lewis Hartz's terms about the fragments, they bring fragments of the Italian experience to Australia, and they subtly, not so subtly, change bits of Australia. So we've invented a term which is not as clever as quite like Facebook folk. It's very clever, but we've thought the term Globalisti. So we call them the Globetrotters, the Globalisti, and we say these are people who see themselves not simply as Italians or as Sicilians or as people from the Veneto, but they see themselves as people who are in motion, and they really understand the modern world in ways that, in a way, we shouldn't forget that they've already met Donald Trump in the form of Silvio. They've already met the modern world. They've already met Brexit. Long before these things happened, they knew these things. They are, if you will, harbingers of the 21st century. They are linked by social media. They understand the world in the same way Italian travellers in the past understood shipping routes and understood shipping timetables, understood railways, and understood the postal services. They understand how the World Wide Web can help them in this process of movement. And they use every possible form of social media. One of the questions we've asked them already is to describe and explain how they use these particular instruments. And when we ask them who they are, yes, they don't want to be thought of as emigrati. They want to be thought of as, and we say, how does the word Globalisti sound? And they said, that sounds okay. That sounds like the sort of word that describes who we are. And for many of them, of course, that who they actually are is really important to understanding how we might perceive them. So how do they feel about Australia? Well, they've already been here. They already understand our government. They already understand Potato Head, Mr. Dutton, because they've met his type before in Italy. They already understand Donald Trump. They already understand Brexit. They already understand our particular problems as a post-colonial nation struggling to identify ourselves as where we are in the world. Because these are the issues that they grew up with in Italy. They get the stuff. They get the refugee policy. They get the reason why Australians are so racist. They get why things go wrong in terms of energy policies in this country. They get all that stuff because that's what they have grown up with in terms of their Italian upbringing. We don't yet know much about their attitude towards Indigenous Australians. We're going to look at their attitude towards how they regard Aborigines in Australia. That's part of our questionnaire we're going to be using. But they do understand a lot of what Australia faces in terms of its challenges. They also, this is a point emphasised in the last seminar, they are living examples of the problem we face in the shift from a state-based and orderly migration process to this anarchic, neoliberal, private capital-driven system we have today. They understand that they are now in the machinery of a set of processes that are going to be throwing them out, chewing them around in ways which are just horrific. And no one in this room would not know just what they go through in terms of the processes of worker exploitation that they endure. But how they describe it, how they think about it, how they experience it, is what we're interested in knowing how they see their role in this process. So we're very much influenced by the work of Peter Mares and so on, looking at this process of this change of government policy, which Bruno talked about a few minutes ago. But only 40% of them say they are being exploited. For reasons we talked about a bit earlier. This is often they're exploited by fellow paesani, or by family, friends, or by people whom they've got to know here in Australia. And because a lot of them are working with Italians or people of Italian descent. And so they also always think, well, if I were back in Italy, maybe I'd be feeling exploited back there too. So they have the capacity to equivocate and to balance things in their lives. They understand that the world is a complex place and they are very small players in that big world. In our conversations so far, which are still off the record because we haven't gone through the ethics process at our university, we've talked to them about the internet and how they see the internet. And they understand the internet is a double-edged sword. It's both a source of information, it's also a source of fake news. And so they're quite sophisticated in their use of that. In fact, this nomet that Bruno referred to very briefly a minute ago in the previous session is a kind, I think, of an important place where you can see, if you go to that website, some of the ambiguities of their location in terms of the politics and the culture of Australia. We don't think they are a unitary group. We think they are profoundly divided between two sets of people. And this is the main argument we want to put to you today. As we drew our sample, which was by Snowball, we kept finding that we've been taken into two quite different sorts of lived experience. The first of those is actually people who see their time in Australia as the extension of their time in Italy. These people typically in academia. And so they think of themselves as astronomers or volcanologists. There's a big field in Italy, of course, is volcanology. And so they bring those skills and competencies and those attitudes and those scientific inquiries to Australia. And in the academic world, of course, is global, and of course they are quite right in thinking they can bring some of these insights and apply them to Australia. And then there's another group who are accepting in Australia casual exploited work. And they know what they're doing. They're not doing it innocently. They know that they're being exploited. They're going from jobs in Italy which might have been, or careers which might have been mid-range to being working in cafes or in farms here in Australia. So if you turn to Deleuze and Guattari, these two French post-structural theorists, they are talking about, in their book 1000 Plateaus, the collision between, basically, to give it put it in one sentence, the collision between Western ideas about how life is ordered, which they call striated. In other words, life is a series of well-defined boundaries and connections and delineations, typical of urban industrial societies, to the world on the frontier, which is a world which is smooth, the world of the nomad, the world of the person who is on the other side of the frontier. And the bringing together of these two groups, the striated and the smooth, is at the heart of post-colonial studies. So in post-colonial studies, we seek to understand this massive collision between the European world particularly and the Asian, African, Australian world in particular. And the other night talking about these large processes, that's the underlying story. The underlying story is this collision. And what Italian migrants uniquely do is traverse both worlds. Because they are growing up in a world which is highly ordered, you can still see the Roman centurialization, the lines of the given Roman legionnaires in Treviso on the Google map today. You still see where they laid out their land. They're going from that ordered world to another world where those boundaries don't make sense. And the navigation across that line, we think, is at the heart of this process. And so in this distinction between smooth and striated careers, we see a whole lot of interesting adaptations to Australia. So for example, Horacio Stefan, who's a good example of a secondary migrant. He was actually a Romanian who moved to Rome with his parents, then migrated to Australia. So he fits in that little category of, the subcategory of people who use Italy as a point of migration, He runs a biscuit company. He has pop-up shops in local markets. He's bringing a serious set of ideas about cooking and putting them into this market here. And I think later in the week we're going to hear from Anthony about Italian food in America. Are we not? A little bit, yeah. Okay, and this is a good example where you can see that this is an example of where you can see the insertion in our culture of this wonderful Italian bakery. We also see it, of course, in the pizza shops. People who go back to Italy to train up how to make a perfect pizza come here and work in our restaurants, opening up bars and restaurants, particularly country towns, because the visa requirements make that easier. And now there's this whole plethora of new Italians running cafes in towns which never had Italians before. In the same way that 50 years ago we had Greek cafes and we had Chinese restaurants in country Australia, we now going to have a whole new generation of these Italians. The internet is what's bringing them together. And when they use the internet, we want to stress something. That is, most of the internet is full of pernicious, nasty stuff. Trolls. That's absent from this conversation. These are people who are trying to support each other. And so their conversation on the internet is informative, it's well-mannered, and it's useful. And what they reject, as one of our informants put it, is the sort of the melancholic sarcasm evident in Alberto Sordi's films like Bello Onesto, Immigrato, Storia Sposere, Compesane Elevati. And so they're saying this isn't what we're about. We're about something else. We're about we're not here to be angry or to be cynical or to be sarcastic or to be melancholic. We're here because we choose at this moment to be here in Australia. And that's quite a different attitude. So the internet is both a source of employment, but it's also a source of information. It's also a source of critique. And we particularly like the work of Giovanni Tiso, who's a New Zealand-based Italian who writes a lot in Australian media a lot, and he talks about the internet as something which will not save us. We've got to move beyond the internet, according to Tiso. We think the social media reflects their origins in Italy, their gender, and their age. We think that that some of the differences across Italy can be identified in the way in which they use them. I won't go into that now, but that's part of our analysis. They find Australia actually is what they thought it was going to be. So here's Roberto learning how to surf, and that, for those of you who don't surf, let me assure you that he is making heavy weather of that. He's having trouble with that surfing, but he's trying his best. And here's Luigina, who thinks it's okay to wear boots on the beach, which that's her choice. But this is, I think, on Facebook you do get to see sometimes, without irony, the differences between how people coming to the country and people living here might use the landscape, or might understand the landscape. Most want to stay. Most are not sure they will be able to, and most of them still have close friendships here who are Italian. But they don't necessarily, we think, have connections back to the older Italian communities. So there we differ from some of the research put by Loretta in a recent paper. These people understand that there's a different world than the preceding world, and they're starting to learn about the preceding world. And so what's being activated here in terms of their own identity politics is a comprehension of what it was like to be an Italian here 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And that in a way helps them understand that although they're being exploited, that maybe working in the Ford factory in Broadmeadows in 1971, where there was a huge strike, a wildcat strike, might have been actually important to know. And they are shocked when we tell them that Italians were not originally part of the working holiday visa scheme. It was designed for Irish kids and British kids. Italians only came because a few people like us in the room fought for it. That's we shouldn't have, but we fought for it back in 2004. So they're kind of learning stuff about our history and culture in a way that's kind of opening their eyes to who they are and who they might be in the future, and where they might live in the future, where they might go in the future. They're not feeling welcomed by the Italian clubs here in Australia. They're not feeling as if these various clubs, which many of you know about, which are very much dialect, regional clubs, want to welcome them. Even the Vento Club in Pauline here in Melbourne doesn't really particularly care for them. And they find that some institutions here are not very helpful. However, they have a very sound idea of the home country because they've actually kept in touch with the home country. In a sense, they don't have a fossilised version of their hometowns, which is refreshing. And none of them have repudiated Italy. One of them said to us about Berlusconi, "Tell me why Berlusconi is bad, and then we can speak." Prove you know about Berlusconi. So there's a bit of loyalty there even about Berlusconi, which we think is quite important. They don't want ill-informed criticism of Italy, and so that in a way again marks them off. And many of them, of course, talk about moving on to other places across Europe and Canada. Will they have an influence in Australia? Well, the more they learn about this country, I think the more they will. Here's some examples of some academics who have interest. Giada Papalea, looking at hybridity. Laura Laurie, who's in this conference, looking at rereading contemporary Italian culture. Fabio Capitanio, working out that the tectonic plates of the world are not the same shape. That's breathtaking stuff. Morella, developing quantum computers. This is really top stuff. And Flavia Nardini set up a space rocket company. I mean this country should be saying thank you. These are just extraordinary achievements, and for sort we haven't seen before. But we saw perhaps in America with the Germans coming after World War II, it's a similar magnitude. And finally, the smooth contribution, and this has been to revitalise the sense of Italianness here in Lygon Street and elsewhere across the country. The sense of, so now we eat in an Italian restaurant, we actually meet kids who are fresh off the plane from Italy, and they can tell you what's going on in Rome yesterday. And that for other Australians to meet them is an extraordinary accomplishment. So we're trying to understand their identity using Deleuze's equalitarian theory, looking at the ideas of their identity not being hybrid at all, but being rhizomatic, in other words, underground. And we're saying how social media actually might help us in this research. And we're saying that they are overall, we're saying that they are interesting and significant. We think that their lives, although they're much smaller number, are worth studying. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.